Hi, everybody. Welcome back to part two of the Modern Civil Rights Movement series from my US2 classes. And we're going to take a look a little bit more at this story and this quest for civil rights. So we're going to see how this works and how we're able to actually handle a lot of these issues and how we're able to solve these problems moving forward after the Birmingham Marches. So today we are going to start with a little bit of a refresher from our last video. So the first thing I want to talk about is our focus. Today we got to be focused on this question. I showed at the beginning of the last video as well. What were the major significant individuals of the civil rights movement and what were some accomplishments? So we saw a lot of individuals, a lot of names, a lot of moments, but when we looked at actual tangible accomplishments, we saw very few of them early on. You can look at Brown versus the Board of Education as a major landmark case. We can also see this kind of coming together, this unity, or finding a unified leader under Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And that is a few accomplishments, but there's got to be a whole lot more, and that's what we're going to see today. We're going to learn a couple more names, a couple more events, but we're going to see more of the accomplishment sides of today than we are going to see necessarily of brand new individuals, although we will see some. We're also going to see some that have a different path, what they believe, to actually achieving civil rights, because not everybody agreed with Dr. King. The first thing we're going to do is start with a quick review of where we left off in our last video, and we're going to pick off today at the 1963 Birmingham Marches. So this was really this big event that tried to change the perception of the federal government towards the civil rights movement after the bombing in Birmingham that killed 4 young girls at the 16th Street Baptist Church. And so we're going to do a quick little review of what we talked about at the end of our last video and where it fits into us today. And Martin Luther King Jr. is really going to try to change public opinion. He's really going to try to reinvigorate the public. And really, the President of the United States, JFK or John Fitzgerald Kennedy, to openly support the struggle that African Americans are going through in this country. And he's going to do that via something called the Birmingham March. And so in the Birmingham March, they are going to try to march on the capital city of Birmingham in Alabama to try to push lawmakers to enact change. It's a huge, massive walk. It's going to be highly publicized on news networks across the country. And while it's being publicized, the police officer, the police commissioner in this area in Birmingham, his name is Bull Connor, is going to use a lot of brutal force to try to break up these protests. He is going to break out the fire department hoses and have them spray these protesters, which is going to rip off skin and force them into the ground and cause severe issues. They're going to use police attack dogs on these people. They are going to arrest so many different people. It's all going to be captured on camera, and the American public is going to be disgusted with what's happened and ask for change. They're going to demand change. All of this brutality is really going to shift the public sentiment towards pushing the civil rights, and the civil rights legislation is really going to start to build up, and it's really going to start to begin. You can see here in this photo that's actually captured and distributed around the country of people being hosed down with fire hoses. They shoot out so much pressure that it's going to absolutely break skin and cause severe issues and damages to people. You're going to see people attacked by giant German shepherds that the police are using to break up what they call these criminals who are protesting for equal treatment. And even Martin Luther King Jr. himself is going to be thrown into jail. So this movement is really going to start a wide variety of support across the country and a lot of change across the country about what is going on with inequality in this country. And you have this famous line here after he's thrown in jail that he writes in a letter that says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." That he is calling for civil rights, he is calling for equality, and he's calling for change now. Probably one of the most famous moments in the civil rights movement early on is the March on Washington. So all of these different African American civil rights groups, CORE, the SCLC led by King, the NAACP, and SNCC, all are going to organize this march, literally a march on Washington, D.C. to pressure the government to push for civil rights legislation, a Civil Rights Act. This is not the first time marches have happened. The KKK has even had rallies and marches on Washington. You're going to see the Bonus Army after World War I have it. You are going to see this threat of a march by A. Philip Randolph in the Double V campaign. So there's all of these examples of this doing in the past, and there actually have been some examples of positive change that came from it. This is where Martin Luther King is going to give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, really pushing for equality. And you're going to see the Kennedy administration being very, very responsive, and they're going to lay down the framework for the Civil Rights Act. However, Kennedy himself is never going to be able to actually do that because he is going to be assassinated. And so that's going to fall on the shoulders and the legacy of Johnson. This is a picture at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., of him giving that famous speech. And you can actually listen to recordings. And it's on YouTube, and you can hear that actual speech and how powerful that major speech is. Problem is, there's going to be the Kennedy assassination. And even though this is a very, very negative event, that Kennedy is going to be killed, it's going to create this big energy behind it to push things like legislation, a Civil Rights Act, and then eventually the Voting Rights Act, pass it in his honor. So although it is terrible that Kennedy was assassinated, his death created so much massive social change. After the assassination of JFK, it's going to really create a big energy around this movement because JFK was really starting to come around for actual civil rights and social change. And he was actually very, very popular towards the end of his life. Now, he has a lot of problems at the beginning part of his terms, but he has a lot of success towards his last couple months that he's alive before he's killed. The vice president for JFK was a man by Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, and he takes over. He's really going to make pushing these civil rights legislations a huge part of his presidency. He's going to make it a huge piece that he wants to push forward. And they do things in memory of President Kennedy. They're doing things in his memory, and this is going to be enough to actually encourage people to create a change because he was so well loved towards the end of his life. And one major change, this is an accomplishment that you can write down, something called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what this did was this takes that desegregation notice from the Brown versus the Board of Education case and applies it to everything else. So after Brown versus the Board of Education, only schools were supposed to be desegregated. Everything else could be segregated. This officially sort of puts an end to a lot of these Jim Crow laws, not all of them, but most of them. And any public facilities, whether it be churches or lunch counters or buses, are going to be desegregated by federal law. So this is huge, huge, huge accomplishment. We're spreading out change and we're actually getting change. Now, this wasn't the only thing that they wanted, and they're going to continue to push for equality. And one of the biggest events that happens is called the March on Selma, or the March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, the capital of Alabama. And at this protest, there's going to be a massive amount of violence. And on one particular day called Bloody Sunday, a bunch of peaceful protesters are going to be attacked and assaulted. And it's really going to shake people across the country more than any other event. This brand new technology of the 1950s, the television, is going to broadcast all of this violence across the country. It's really going to show people how bad tensions are in the South. If you live in Los Angeles or San Francisco, if you live in the middle of Montana or in Nebraska or Kansas, if you live up in Boston or live in Providence, Rhode Island, you may have absolutely no idea how bad it really is. And this protest, this event, is going to create massive shockwaves of change once the public sees how bad the tensions are really in the South. This is also the focus of the movie Selma, which was a very recent film that was made. It's an amazing film about this event and the protest and how it's done. But it's a great movie to watch if you want to understand this particular event. There are people that are going to face severe forms of violence, even if they're not a person of color themselves, people helping this movement. This man, for example, is going to be jailed for carrying a placard that says vote register worker, trying to register different people for voting. He got 5 days in jail for carrying that. You're going to see different people from different faiths start to come and support this movement. Different clergymen are going to be called in by Martin Luther King Jr. to try to rally in different types of support, such as the Jewish community. This rabbi was beaten with a tire iron, that piece of equipment that's used to take off the nuts and the bolts on the side of the tires that hold them in, this giant solid piece of iron, is going to be used to bludgeon this rabbi, this holy man. And so all of these examples of violence, they're not just going to be people of color, but white individuals that are willing to take up this mantle and suffer too. This is a huge change. You're going to see different kind of questions, though. We're going to see people moving sometimes towards a much more radical movement after we get to the later part of the 1960s. They're going to be encouraging people to speak out, encouraging people to do something about it, right? If you just sit there and you allow this to happen, as this quote says, then damn your souls. We're going to see people trying to register to vote, but realize that it's not just physical punishment that could be a problem for a lot of these individuals. It could also be economic ways of trying to constrain and restrict people from votes. If blacks registered to vote, in some cases, the local banks could call on the loan for their home or their farm, and that could put them out of any form of business, any form of living. And so people really had to question, was this worth it? And a lot of people were too scared to register because they were fearful of the repercussions of these actions. You're going to see this big movement of voter registration equality in Selma, Alabama in 1965, and this is going to be a national known event. They're going to walk across this famous bridge on their march towards Montgomery, and they're going to be met with police violence, with clubs and weapons and gas masks and horses, and it's going to be broadcasted around the country. People are going to see what happens here at Bloody Sunday, and you won't be able to ignore this inequality anymore when these peaceful protesters are bludgeoned by these armed forces. You can actually see some of the raw clips here by checking out this link. This is the type of stuff that was pushed around the country. So you have a couple things going on here. One, you have organized movements for civil rights. You see this protest movement that is taking a more grassroots, people-motivated movement. And three, we see the impact of technology on society. All of these things are working together at the same moment. So there's many different objectives we can hit by looking at some of these events, like Bloody Sunday. After a lot of the violence that people see at the Selma March, LBJ and Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is incredibly important. It bans the literacy tests, which are trick questions that are written, and if you fail one question on this test, you won't be eligible to vote. It also sends federal voting officials into the South to protect these voters from their rights being taken away or them being stopped from being able to vote. This really is the completion of what the radical Republicans wanted back in the Reconstruction era. If you started with me at the beginning of the year, this was really what we pushed for. This is what we started with. And it's going to be 100 years after the Civil War actually ends and 95 years after the 15th Amendment, which gave them the right to vote, was actually passed. So this actually allows them to fully use that vote without fear of it being taken away from them. You can see a huge force in voting patterns, that this is going to create a massive wave of change for the following decades of today, where African Americans become a huge force in politics. Right after the Civil War, we can think about what happened where black voters became this huge voter pool that helped keep Republicans in power, like Grant. But as the Jim Crow laws were enacted and more of these restrictions were enacted, it really prevented them from actually being able to exercise that right to vote. And so this is the first major time you can actually see this. Now, if you look at these maps up here, this is the Deep South. The percentage of the voting age blacks that are actually registered to vote, so everybody that is of voting age, what percentage is actually registered to vote? Look at Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina. Less than 1% of all black individuals that are of age to vote in 1940, a year after World War II really begins. That's how few African Americans are actually registered to vote. Now look in 1964, the year before this happens, the big voting rights movement. Mississippi is still heavily far behind, only 6.7%. There's change here, but 1968, 3 years after the Voting Rights Act. We have people in the 80s, 70s, all throughout the 60s, everybody over 50% here now. And then flash forward to 1976, right? That's just about a decade past this legislation. Look how high the percentage of African Americans that can vote are actually registered. You can also look at the total percent. In 1940, 3% of African Americans that could of age that could actually vote were actually registered. By the time you get to 1976, 63.1% are registered. That is massive, tangible change. You can also look at this map, and you're going to see two different numbers here. I'm going to erase these little red marks. You are going to see, number one, the amount of African Americans registered in 1960, and number two, the amount of African Americans registered in 1966. So 1960 is the election of JFK. 1966 is 2 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed. 1 year after the Voting Rights Act was passed, and 2 years after the Civil Rights Act. Now, this is important because 1966 is a midterm election year, so this is going to drastically change the political landscape. So you will see here first in red the amount of voters when JFK was elected versus the percentage of voters that were elected, or the percentage of African American voters that were registered to vote during the midterm election of 1966. You can see all these examples of massive change. Mississippi is the most extreme, but also South Carolina. You are going to see progress all throughout this country. That percentage, that number you see, is the percentage of increase in these areas. So Mississippi from 1960 to 1966 had a 695.4% increase in the number of Black voters that are registered. Not everybody actually agreed with Martin Luther King's way to actually earn civil rights, though, and a lot of people felt that he was enabling a lot of this violence to happen. You're going to see people like Malcolm X, Dr. Huey Newton, and Stokely Carmichael all start to question if nonviolent protest is the best way to do it, because some of these gains really stop after 1965. And probably the most well-known example of people that question the nonviolent protest movement is a man by the name of Malcolm X. Now, his birth name is Malcolm Little. He experiences a lot of racism. He actually lives in the North. He works in Boston at a famous hotel. But after getting into some run-ins with the law and some crime, and he becomes radicalized while in prison, he is going to really kind of reject these ideas of nonviolent protest because he's seen racism in the North. It's very, very different than racism in the South. And his experience shows him that it's not going to shake up the status quo in the North unless there's more extreme action. He's going to go to the extent where he's going to remove his last name, Little, as he calls it, a slave name, a name all the way back to the dates when his ancestors were slaves, and that this gave rejection and kind of rebirth, if you will, of culture and embracing his blackness. He is going to really advocate the use of weapons for self-defense. Now, understand what self-defense means. This doesn't mean that they're going to go out and they're going to start shooting up places or they're going to start pushing for violence, but they're going to advocate for, if we are attacked, that we should be able to defend ourselves. And if we are being nonviolent, all we're doing is we are encouraging whites to be violent towards us because they know that there's going to be zero ramifications for these actions. Malcolm X ultimately converts to something called the Nation of Islam while he's serving time in jail. And he really starts to change his viewpoints. It's not so much about this nonviolent protest movement because it's not working for people in the North as it is for people in the South. So he's really going to change some of his ideas to separate himself from maybe the prevalent belief systems of maybe like Martin Luther King Jr. And he's actually going to start to pick up followers of his own, a movement of his own. Malcolm has a couple different teachings. One of them is kind of the central belief is all of the problems that they're dealing with now are very long, strung out problems. These are not new. All of the problems that the Black man has in society are because of whites. The whites are in power. White men are making these decisions. They are the people that brought African slaves to this country. And so as a result, they are the source of a lot of these problems that they're facing. Number two, he believed in black separatism. He didn't necessarily want integration. He didn't want us to, as he would say, he didn't want us to fit into white America. He wanted culture that was uniquely black, that we could be separate, and that's not a bad thing. We don't all have to mix and get along. We can have our own separate places, and that's totally fine, as long as black culture isn't being suppressed and black society is being protected by people that look like them. And really, it's all about having pride in your identity and your culture. That's one of the reasons why he drops his last name Little, because he relates it back to the slavery days where his great ancestors actually got that last name. So he really pushes against things like that to try to create movements of his own and this idea about unity between African Americans in their own culture and identity. This is one little quote from Malcolm X in 1964. I believe in the brotherhood of man, all men, but I don't believe brotherhood with anybody who doesn't want brotherhood with me. I believe in treating people right, but I'm not going to waste my time trying to treat somebody right who doesn't know how to return the treatment. That these people do not want to change their heart. If they don't want to, they won't. And so that is his huge problem, that by laying down that all you're doing is enabling this mistreatment. Ultimately, we can look further into this movement that it's not just Malcolm X that does not agree with Martin Luther King Jr. Towards the end of Martin Luther King's life, he is going to have a couple interactions with a man by the name of Stokely Carmichael, who's going to be the founder of the Black Power movement. He is really going to push for this idea that nonviolent protest, like it worked in the early 60s, but now it's not really a viable means of actually ending things by the end. That you need to be able to combat racism. You need to be able to push equality. You can't just sit back and wait for it to happen. You have to keep this momentum going, and it's going to really bring about this willingness to fight with violence. Fight if you are violently attacked. That yes, you can fight back. That you must stand your ground. You must be fervent in this, and it's going to lead to the rise of different groups like the Black Panther Party. There are going to be this. There's going to be this larger movement of this swing from King's movement towards things that really take over with the new generation, like Stokely Carmichael. And there's a couple of reasons why the lack of practical success by the end of the 1960s, but then also the death of major leaders. Malcolm X assassinated 1965. 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. 1963, JFK was already killed. 1968 as well, Bobby Kennedy, JFK's brother, huge champion for civil rights, he is also killed. And so there's going to be a lot of conflict going on, not to mention the Vietnam War is sucking a lot of this political focus and a lot of this monetary focus away from actually gaining practical rights. It's going to just create more and more and more conflict. These are pictures of Black Panthers. They would dress in similar uniforms. They would kind of be the police force for these Black communities. They would all dress the same in a similar way that other fighting forces have uniforms as well. The person that created the Black Panthers, Dr. Huey Newton, even speaks on it a little bit further about why he believes what he believes. The blood, sweat, tears, and suffering of Black people are the foundation of wealth and power of the United States. We were forced to build America, and if forced to, we will tear it down. That's a revolution, right? The immediate cause of this destruction will be the suffering and bloodshed, but the end result will be perpetual peace for all mankind. There will be a bloody revolution, but it's going to lead to peace negotiations future. So the ends justify the means. This is just a quote from Stokely Carmichael, and not everybody got along in this movement. There was division inside the movement, just like there was division for the 15th Amendment amongst women activist groups about what was the correct thing to do. Should they support the 15th Amendment? Should they not? Carmichael is going to give this massive speech at the end of a huge walk and a rally at night in a park. And there's actually a picture of him giving that speech, the Black Power speech. It says Dr. King's major assumption was that if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and will be moved to change his heart. That's very good. He made one fallacious false assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. That these people, these oppressors, are not people of heart, of good conscience, that these people are evil, and that's why this must be stopped. Malcolm X does have this religious conversion, and he also has a conversion kind of politically towards the end of his life, where he's moving more towards political equality in a different sense, where he is moving towards this concept of voting rights as becoming more and more apparent as being so important. And he really starts this movement of trying to get the right to vote, just like Martin Luther King does, but he also throws on some other caveats that if we don't, we are going to fight and we are going to riot until we're given this right. We can't wait for these things to come towards us. We need them now because this is the fundamental thing that has been holding back Black people in this country in Malcolm X's mind. There are more people than Malcolm X that believe in things like this, and there are even groups that form. One of the most famous groups is a group called the Black Panthers that form out in Oakland, California. But just like the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, I really want to stress this: is they are not going out just to go create violence to kill people when they're originally formed. That's not their goal. They're not trying to perpetrate violence necessarily, but they see a world around them that is very violent and feel like they need to protect themselves. The number one reason for the formation of the Black Panthers is all of this police brutality that they see in a lot of the ghettos in Oakland, California, and that they feel like that if you have these Black communities that are all Black, why are they being policed by white officers? Black officers, Black police forces should be in charge of their own communities, of the people like them. And they're going to use this idea of almost kind of create like a mini military or a mini police force to try to combat not only what they deem as corrupt police actions from the white officers from the Oakland PD that's coming through, but also to protect their own people, not from the police brutality, but also protect and police their own people from crimes within their communities. The problem is with many of these other organizations is that the Black Panther Party really becomes radicalized very quickly. They start marching around the streets with assault rifles, and this doesn't do well in media. It doesn't portray them as in a very good light, and so they are going to become seen as this militant force that just wants to create violence rather than stop solving it and then stop it and trying to solve this problem. And the numbers are going to get pretty big. They're going to get up to a point where there's over 2,000 members of this Black Panther Party, but they never really get bigger beyond that because of different police shootouts with the FBI and police. It's really hard for them to recruit, and they get a really, really negative connotation. So the Black Panther Party really does start to die out. You also again see this kind of militant dress and similar uniforms and weapons, but again, the idea is to protect themselves from these foreign, in their minds, these foreign forces that are imposing their will on their communities, that they feel like Black communities need to be policed by Black officers, and that's what the Black Panther Party set out to be. Now, the problem is, despite all of these different paths to try to achieve civil rights and all these different ideas, the civil rights movement really loses steam. It really loses progress, and it's because of two specific things. Number one, the Vietnam War, and number two, there's many assassinations that occur. So when we're talking about the Vietnam War takes a lot of money, takes a lot of attention and focus off of the civil rights movement after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So they're not going to have the political support of what's going on. All of the energy is going to be shifted away from the domestic front and the civil rights movement to fighting this war in Vietnam. The second thing that's really going to hurt the civil rights movement from continuing to gain success is because many of their leaders are being assassinated, and because of that, the different groups, whether it's the nonviolent or the violent protest groups, are leading through a couple individuals that are eventually going to be assassinated. It really creates a lack of conformity, a lack of unity in this movement, and it makes it very hard to continue when things get rough. For example, Malcolm X is assassinated in 1965. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned with that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed for me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you. This is Martin Luther King's last speech he gives in 1968 before his life is all. And on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. will be assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee by a man by the names of James Earl Ray. So all of these major leaders are going to be taken out. There's all of this hostility that's still brewing in this country, and it makes it very hard for these changes to actually persevere when all of these things are going on. That doesn't mean there's not a lot of change that happens, because there's so much change that occurs because of this movement throughout the late 50s and early 60s. So really, if you want a side by side, just kind of to bring it back, Martin Luther King is more from a middle class family, and Malcolm X is going to be on the kind of lower end of the socioeconomic status. Martin Luther King Jr. is in the South, Malcolm X is in the North. They don't have the same background. Martin Luther King has much more privilege than Malcolm X does. Martin Luther King is going to advocate more for nonviolent direct action, nonviolent resistance, right? So it's active agitation and questioning things, but he's not going to use violence to fight back. And Malcolm X is going to advocate for self-defense. It's not going out and attacking other people, but if you are attacked, fight back. Martin Luther King is actively going to call for integration. What's interesting about Malcolm X is not everybody wanted integration. Some people thought that, even black leaders thought, that segregation was fine, that we're going to have our own communities that are going to be united, and we should be able to police and govern our own communities, that black leaders should govern black communities and white leaders can govern their own white communities, but they should be able to be left alone. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King really wanted to call for this heavy integration. But one thing that Martin Luther King is able to do is he's able to unite people of different colors, not just blacks, but whites who have a larger access to financial means that help really fund this movement. And there are many different critiques of each group. So, for example, a lot of people question Martin Luther King's ability. He was too young, many people said. They weren't assertive enough, they weren't doing enough, that they were too passive, that this isn't getting any actual change. Meanwhile, Malcolm X is being claimed of kind of being a fearmonger, of doing things just for own personal gain, not really for the glory of the rest of the group and for actual equality. So there are many critics on both sides. And a lot of people look at Martin Luther King's work as almost it's unfinished, like this statue in this cartoon. That there is much equality that is gained. You can look at de jure segregation being ended, de jure equality legally. There's all these things, but de facto, did it change everything? As a matter of fact, somewhat, but did it completely change everything? Absolutely not. Because if that was the case, there would be no hatred, there would be no discrimination, there would be no prejudice, there would be no racism today. But we also know that's not true. But there are massive leaps and bounds that they make. So just as one kind of So just in conclusion, some final thoughts. When we look at the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, we really do see a lot of political equality that's actually gained. Despite this political equality that is gained and social and economic equality is also being pushed for, there's a movement from Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent protest methods to some more radical movements by the end of the 1960s. So there's different types of people looking for answers to these questions. And at the end of the day, this is not just a civil rights movement for African Americans. There are young college students that are looking for a voice in politics. There are Mexican Americans that are fighting for civil rights, women, the LGBTQ community, Native Americans, Asian Americans that are all fighting for different forms of unity. So there's a lot of information here, but if you have any questions about this video or the last one, please feel free to drop a comment down in the section below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Peace.